And we are live, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Knocked Conscious. It is my absolute honor, privilege. It is amazing. I get to speak with an economics genius who is levels above where I can even hope to be. Per Bylund, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, thanks
You
for
were
having
on
me on.
Jason's you were on Jason's podcast yesterday. We have a lot of overlap, and Jason and you had such a great conversation. I'm not going to spoil it, but he was kind enough to let me listen to it so that I wouldn't sound redundant. But thank you so much for joining me. Please tell us who you are and what is it you do?
Well, very briefly, I was born and raised in Sweden, and now I'm in the US. I'm an associate professor of entrepreneurship, and I'm also a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, where I, among other things, I'm the associate editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, one of the two main academic journals, peer reviewed and everything, for Austrian economics.
Oh, that is absolutely amazing. And you've written a couple books, if I may. I see the most recent one is The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized: How Regulations Affect Our Everyday Lives. Is that the most recent piece that you've written, Per?
No, it's not, and that's sort of my middle book. So the first I
Okay,
had
your
the
middle
problem
book.
of production, and then the seen, the unseen, the unrealized, and they were published the same year, so it's hard to tell which was really first.
Okay.
But and
No,
then
no worries. And then yeah, go ahead.
the most recent one is how to think about the economy, a primer, which was
Yes,
published in
about that.
2022.
Yes, about that. I think I have a bone to pick with you, sir. I believe you were trolling someone on the Twitter, and I don't think that was a very kind thing. I'm gonna pull it up because I thought it was very interesting. Here's the screen, if I may. This is Pear's tweet. Karen Bass, right? Mayor Karen Bass, she said, "We are launching a new simple intake system to report price gouging. Call my LA 311 to report illegally hiked rents and prices. We have no tolerance for it." Per, to which you responded, "I've written a short, easy understand book that seems you would greatly benefit from reading. Be happy to send you a complimentary copy." Here it is right there. Per Bylund, How to Think About the Economy, a primer. So there it is. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, how are a couple good ways to get these two pieces of literature?
Well, the primer is easy because you just go to mises.org/primer and you pick it up there. I mean, you can. It's been the PDF and EPUBs have been free to download since it was published. There's the audiobook. It's also free unless you go through Audible or something like that. But it's free on Spotify and download the MP3s and whatever. And the paperback version, you can buy that for 0 as well from the Mises store. I think you might have to pay for shipping though.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, I love some of the things because these ideas you're making about as available as possible without having to charge anything. How is it how did you what's your origin story? How did you get to something of this, focus and find that the message is the import even versus even, monetizing it or anything?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. It has a very long answer. But I mean, just the
I
book
do that a lot.
itself. Yeah, the book itself was really a product of my talking to Jeff Deist, who was the president of the Mises Institute until recently, a couple of years ago, I suppose. And I expressed some frustration that there is no up to date, sort of modern go to resource for whoever is interested in just learning economics. And there, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of introductions to Austrian economics in on different levels and different price points and things like that, but none that I was really happy with. And the typical one, if someone would ask you, what should I read to sort of get some basic knowledge on how the economy functions, the typical reference would be Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And
That that was
it's a
my dipping toe.
yeah, and it's a great book, but the thing is, it's only one lesson, right? It has some
Yes.
like 35 chapters or something like that, but it's the same lesson over and over again, applied on different things. It's an important lesson, and it's a core to economics too, and core to understanding the economy. But how do you get from that one lesson to, say, business cycles, or what is the impact of regulations and things like that? And there was nothing like that. So since I suggested it, of course, then I had to write it myself, and I agreed with came to an agreement with Jeff that they would publish it, and I was to write it as though Henry Hazlitt had written it, so in the same kind of language, so to the point, easy to understand, no jargon, definitely no math or anything like that,
Right.
and just talk about how should you think? Well, how do you reason about the economy? And I was supposed to keep it under half as long as economics in one lesson. So I set about doing that, which was not easy to say the least. I don't know how many
It's
times
hard to
I
make
wrote.
something so succinct even more succinct, right? And make it and
Yeah, and
still
it,
add
right, and
concepts to it.
and the problem here was that yes, it was supposed to be half as long, but it's not only one lesson anymore. It was supposed to be basically comprehensive and and cover the whole uh, economic theory in that half as much space, which was
Mhm.
really difficult. And do it simply. Of course, I had to skip a lot of nuance and details and things like that. That is, of course, obvious. I think, but it took me a while to just find the right tone and the right level and the right approach. And being an academic, you want to always step back and make sure you get the full picture across and start with the assumptions and everything like that. And that was not the point of this book. And the same thing with many Austrian economics introductions. They start with the history of the school rather than the ideas and the theories of the school. So they would say, well, in the beginning there was Carl Menger, and then so forth.
Mhm.
And
Right.
this was
So
not
it's almost
supposed
like
to
a
be
historical biographical mixed in with the
right. And then you get the ideas from each of these huge characters that created the Austrian corpus as we have it today. And then you would go, well, Menger said this, and then Böhm-Bawerk said this, and so forth. And I mean, that's interesting. But if you just want to become economically literate, you don't really need to know who the people were or when they were or anything like that. You don't need to know who said what. You just need to figure out, well, what are we doing? And what does the economy do? And how do I think about this thing? And that was sort of the purpose of that book to have something. When I wrote it, I played in my mind that what if some kid would, these obnoxious uh, teenage Austro-libertarians, they just can't shut up. And at Thanksgiving dinner, grandma is nice and said, well, what is a good introduction to everything you're talking about? This is interesting. What can I read? Well, my primer should be that sort of book that you can give to grandma, and grandma should be able to read it, understand it, and it should be so short and quick a read that she would actually get through it as well. So that was sort of the goal I had. Whether I was successful is a different matter, but I tried to get to that point in a way.
It is in the queue, I promise you. Right now, I'm working on Scott Horton's book, Provoked, which is still just a Bible and a half, and we're trying to do a book review, so I am focused solely on my reading on that, but I do plan to get back into economics, which is why I did wanna reach out to you, and that you reached back out so quickly was so grateful, so I'm so grateful for that. I Some things I'd like to think about that I love is this ability for someone like yourself and someone like myself who completely opposite ends of the, state or the country or wherever, who don't know each other. You're at a status here and I'm down here. We're able to speak now through this technology, and you're able to share and communicate with the people who happen to be on with me and the people with you and share these ideas in such an amazing way. And it's such a beautiful thing. Is there anything are you hopeful for the future more than you are pessimistic about the future, the way the economy is going and the way the economics are headed?
Yeah, I try to stay optimistic all the time, but I think it's the future is hopefully a very, very big place in terms of time, right? So the future is tomorrow as well as 1,000 years from now. And I think I would say that short term, I'm probably always pessimistic. But in the longer term, I'm optimistic. I think we're going to find our way back to freedom and peace and prosperity. It's just that we're going to have to go through some kind of hell first. Not necessarily a complete implosion, but I think some things are definitely going to get worse before they get better.
Yeah. I would argue I'm a Generation Xer. I'm actually just a little bit older than you, unfortunately. I'm not gonna say that, but I turned 50 this year or last year in 24, so, we're about a year apart, and, the '90s were glorious.
Mhm.
At least, without a rock being in on the forefront, here it just seemed like like, late '80s, early '90s was just, like, the most amazing time, and it's like that fourth turning, with Neil Howell where he talks about these things, and I've always argued that I I know where we can go, and I do think we will get there, but it's never where we are, and it's never where we're going, but it's the transitional period that is the big pain, and I'm gonna admit, I'm a chicken. I don't wanna go through one of these transitional periods. Do you have a prediction of a time frame? Is it a 20-year period, 10, 15 that we might have one of these transitional periods that might be foreseen?
No, I have no idea, and I don't
Okay,
think it's
so it's
gonna
not a
be the
timing
same.
issue.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be the same all over the world either, so it sort of depends on where you are.
Right.
So I don't. I mean, a positive trend I see now is empires falling apart and breaking up into smaller parts, and the same thing with countries. I mean, but in some cases, that's due to CIA meddling with domestic politics, and then of course that's not a good development, even though it's secession or whatever. But I, in some places, it's going to be a peaceful transition. It's going to be pretty swift and pretty soon, perhaps too. Whereas in other places, it's going to take a while. I mean, you're not going to get rid of, say, I'm just pulling something out of my ass, basically. But the Taliban, for instance, they're not going to become a rights-based republic. There's super modernized overnight. But they're going to get there, I'm pretty sure. But the question is when. I mean, I have no
Mhm.
idea when that's going to be.
So we always talk about these 2 things. Obviously, we had the California wildfires. We've had Lahaina, North Carolina, all these devastating places. Jason touched upon it. We talk about all these opportunities now to build and grow where it's only on the ledger sheet. It looks like it's growth, but it's really just internal repatching and rebuilding. It actually isn't prosperous. I see that similar in war. I say war is profitable, but it's not prosperous.
Oh yeah.
How how do we just how are we justifying as a country, or how are we justifying as a nation the war? Because I imagine the breadbasket just absolutely poisoned with all the chemicals from the shelling and the bombs in Ukraine right now. And that isn't that is not healthy for society. So how do we spread that message of peace to this new administration who seems to be against it, but seems to have an issue with Iran all of a sudden? And it's like they just want to shift from here to here. They're just playing the shell game, and it's two wings of the same bird versus different complete ideologies about peace and war. I just love to hear some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the problem with war, especially in this country, is that it doesn't affect most people in the US. Even though the United States is at war, not formally because there's been no declaration, but there are troops in plenty of countries, there are bases in plenty of countries, and they're involved in all kinds of fights all over the place and all the time. So there are plenty of wars that the US is involved in. The issue here is that, of course, you're not going to get a a resistance to this domestically because people aren't really affected all that much and they don't know about it, and maybe watch it on the news or something like that, but they are not personally affected very much. I mean, many people in the military, not even Americans. And then you have a small elite that make a ton of money off of selling materials to the Department of Defense or in other ways dealing with the Department of Defense, and picking up um, selling guns to both sides in the conflict and stuff like that. And of course, they have a lot of more influence in DC than most voters do, and especially since voters aren't really affected, or I should say they don't think they're affected, right? Because the problem here is the economics of it, right? That we don't notice that we lose something because what we lose is primarily what we would have gotten otherwise. So we're
Yeah,
losing out on the upside, but we don't know what the upside would have been. So how can we? I mean, we're not hurt by it because we don't know
right,
about it. The
right.
problem, of course, is that we're stuck on a comparatively much poorer level, all of us, because of this, but we just don't notice it.
Devalue well, can we say a devalued level, correct? I mean, we could talk wealth all we want, but it's just the value of the dollar is nothing what it originally was from the printing and the debt that we've accrued over time.
Yeah, and that's by design, right? Because there are plenty of upsides from whoever controls that the dollar and the whole infrastructure around it by inflating it because they get the money first and all that sort of thing. For people in general, I mean, our prosperity might be great compared to previous times in history, but not compared to where we would have been without the wars and without the regulations, without getting off the gold standard and all this other stuff, right? We would have been much, much, much richer, all of us. And there's basically no reason why we would be working 40 plus hours a week to then live paycheck to paycheck. That doesn't make any sense. But and we would be able to get our current standard of living working maybe half a day a week or something like that had we not had all this BS going on throughout the 20th century. But since we don't know about it, we're not going to question uh, what we have, and we're also not going to be upset about it because we don't know what we're losing out on. And that's sort of the that's the main point of the unrealized and the seen, the unseen, and the unrealized, that there's so many opportunities and so much prosperity creation that we're missing out on because of regulations. And I go through the whole mechanism and the processes why that is the case in the book. But we're on such a lower prosperity generative trajectory than we would have been that comparatively speaking, we're dirt poor, all of us. But since we have never been on that other trajectory that where we would have been. We just don't know about it, and therefore we don't
Right.
consider ourselves burdened by it or hurt by it.
That's excellent point. It's kinda like measuring a negative, right? You can't see the non-effects of nothing, right, or whatever, so,
Yeah, exactly.
a gentleman, Zach's on, in the chat with us. I think you've spoken with him before. I'm gonna put this question up. Do you think the manipulation of the markets by the Fed is influenced by bad acting on the behalf of the Intel state? So versus the Fed or something like that on the Intel state. How about that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I haven't looked into this much at all. I mean, the actual data and stuff like that, so I can't really say. But I would be surprised if the deep state is not involved. And of course, in all the meddling all over the world, uh, where does all this money come from? It's not taxation, and I'm sure there's plenty of the money being created that sort of goes into uh, shadow budgets and these black holes that no one really knows much about to fund all this stuff. And I'm sure that there's plenty of price fixing and price tampering in all kinds of markets by all kinds of authorities and agencies and possibly foreign actors and mafias and well, mafias other than the state, and all kinds of other organizations that benefit from doing this sort of thing. So, I mean, it's the problem with the stock market right now, and since a few decades, is that it's not really the evaluation of businesses much anymore. And there's this um, rather well known issue of well, how do you know if you're in a fairly free market rather than in a central planned economy? What is the one thing that would distinguish between the two? What can we say? And Mises was asked this question and put and pressured to give an answer. And his answer was, well, if there's a stock market, that's sufficient to call it a market, not free market, but it's at least free enough sort of that it works. But that answer, I think, assumes, it hinges on the stock market being a bidding for businesses based on valuation of what they produce in terms of profits, and profits and being in a sense derived from how much they satisfy consumers. The problem today is that we have so much uh, money invested that are not invested by someone looking at the business and going, I wonder if this business is going to do better or worse into the future. Are they well positioned to satisfy people? Are they investing enough in research and development? Are they innovative? Do they think outside the box and all this stuff? That's a fraction, only a fraction of trades in the stock market are based on this. Instead, they're based on algorithm. And these algorithms, they are to simplify a little bit, they're basically saying that, well, if the price previously has not moved a whole lot and suddenly now it moves up a lot and then there is a plateau, then buy because it's going to go up again. That sort of thing. And that has
And
nothing
so
to,
it's
at
more
all
pattern recognition, right? In a weird way.
in the statistic of the price, sort of the price movements, right? And that's not a valuation at all. But of course, the bidding and the buying and selling of the stock at different prices will affect the price. So you have these algorithms doing the statistical analysis of price movements that determine the prices of the stocks, which is really intended to be a valuation of the businesses, but it's not anymore if it's just a statistical analysis of price movements. So the stock market and which stocks go up and down and by how much, it's it can be augmented or it can be moderated by algorithms, and who knows how many of those trades are by algorithms. I mean, you can probably look into that. I haven't done that, but
Right. That
but
yeah, it sounds like a deep dive.
yeah, yeah, right. And there's a lot of data too. But the
Yeah.
problem here is that just a few trades are made off of uh, what what Buffett and others would call value investing, which to an Austrian is just investing. Of course, you're investing in what you think is going to be valuable, but
Right.
that's sort of a
They also came up with the term junk bond. So it's
well, true.
penny
I
stock.
mean, imagine that we have this world where you have markets for financial instruments where you're investing in a business based on what you think is the value proposition of that business. It's not just investing, it's a special kind of investing that's called value investing. That tells you how just fundamentally wrong this this
All
system
the
is.
economics is. Right.
Yeah, right. And everything in that market, if that is a minority sort of a unique position to have, that, oh, I'm going to invest in the value proposition of these businesses. Well, okay, that means that most investments are not made based off of that. They're based on something else. And usually it's the algorithm, the statistical analysis, and so forth, which then means what does the price actually represent? It's not
Yeah.
a division of intellectual labor, as Mises would put it, uh, of all people trying to figure out what is the best valuation of the business, and then they're sort of putting their own money on the line based off of their best guess. No, that's not it anymore, because most prices are determined to some significant extent only by statistical analysis.
Yeah. That's great. So we've got a couple people in the chat, and I'll continue with one question. I do want to get to regulations because what what broke my brain on regulations was East Palestine and the train accident. Because my understanding was there was a sensor or some kind of bearing that was some 1800s brake system that that failed. And yet the train industry has been around for 300 years or so, right? About, 200 years, right? 1860, yeah, maybe 150 or so, whatever. I'm doing the math a little bit off, but um, regulations come and they add regulations, and you think it's for safety and you think it's for safety. And yet this train that derailed in 2020 had an 1800 system that for some reason regulations missed to have that added to save, to make the train safer. So I'd love for you to explain your concept about regulations, where how they weaponize our compassion against us for our safety, for our protection, for our whatever, and what a lot of regulations end up actually what they're actually intended to do and who puts them in place as a deterrent versus actual a good piece for the the consumer, for example.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know much about that particular example, but it sounds like if they were using sort of old types of parts and stuff like that, those were this is a matter of a bureaucratic management more than the actual regulations, and how probably old solutions were grandfathered in when new regulations were put in place. And well, I mean, if it's grandfathered in, then you can just stick with and use that old thing for as long as you can, and then you don't have to invest in buying something new and producing something new, right? Um, when I address regulations, I do that from an economic theory perspective. So I ask just, okay, what is a regulation intended to do, and what does a regulation do? The regulation just in general. Well, I mean, I'm an entrepreneurship professor, so I understand that the economy is driven by entrepreneurship, and entrepreneurs try to beat existing businesses and other entrepreneurs by providing as much value as possible to consumers. And whoever provides most value is going to make the sale, and they're going to get that revenue. And if they play their cards right, they have kept their costs below their receipts, meaning they make a profit in between. But of course, who benefits the most? That's the consumer still, and that's what pushes the market forward and makes it progress all the time. That you can't really know who is going to satisfy consumers most. So it's a little bit of a guessing game, but entrepreneurs are using all their ingenuity and all their experiences and all their judgment and what have you to do that. So in this situation, then okay, what does a regulation do? Well, a regulation is implemented and imposed on this to make sure that entrepreneurs don't do a certain thing, or that they do more of it, one thing, or they don't go into a certain area. They don't go into meth production even though consumers really want meth or whatever, right? So there's for some reason we, that is the state, or the state as our representatives perhaps, they want to make sure that the outcome is a different one than if entrepreneurs would have acted unhindered, uh, just to satisfy consumer wants. Okay, so now that we know this, that means that if you have a completely free market and you impose one regulation, just one, that means that whatever entrepreneur is affected by this is no longer able to pursue whatever line of production he or she wanted to, that he or she thought was the highest value,
They
right? Because
can't
that's
maximize their,
right, and
say,
they
their
have something
production
in
line
mind.
or their something.
Right,
Right,
they
it's an
imagine that
obstacle
they're
that's
gonna
put in the
produce a
way.
certain product, and they think that this is gonna make me rich, and this is gonna benefit people a lot, and then the regulation somehow makes that impossible, so they're gonna do something else, which necessarily is something that they expect to be of lesser value, because otherwise they would have chosen this other thing first, right? Okay, well, so that's the first result of a regulation. We have some entrepreneurs who no longer pursue the highest value, expected value for consumers. Instead, they pursue some lower expected value for consumers. Okay, so we're worse off already. Then we also know that, well, what do entrepreneurs base their guesses and their production efforts on? Well, they look around and they learn from experience. They learn from others' experience. They go, oh, that didn't work out, but I think I can fix that. Or that worked really well. I'm going to copy that to some extent. So it's cumulative, right? So they're building off of what worked before, much like the iPhone was a an extension or a product that followed the iPod, because they had Apple had the experience of the iPod in many different generations, and they saw this, or Steve Jobs did, I guess, saw these other
And
types of
it's brilliant the way
functionality.
he did that, though. He went iPod, iPhone, iPad, and he just scaled it, and it's such a beautiful business model the way he was able to do that.
Right, and every step of the way, he used what he learned from the previous generation of products, right? So the iPhone was a revolution, I agree, but it was impossible without the iPod, and that's within the company, but the market works that way too, right? That you're you they always look around and they copy what works and they abandon what obviously didn't work and that sort of thing. Well, if in our little economy now, if entrepreneurs can't pursue the highest value for consumers, but the second highest value, that's what other entrepreneurs are going to build off of. They're not going to build off of the highest value because
Right.
That didn't take place, right? So we're on a much lower trajectory, and we're not never ever going to get to that point of prosperity where entrepreneurs were trying to get us before because of this one regulation, and that's going to stay with us forever. And every time an entrepreneur tries to do something that is affected by this and or restricted by this one regulation, they're going to pick some other thing to do, or some other entrepreneurs instead are going to try their luck that is of lower value. So this regulation is going to continue to force down the economy's prosperity generative capability for as long as it is in force. And we're still just talking about one regulation.
Right.
And over generations, there's going to be a lot of entrepreneurs who have chosen the second highest uh, type of production that they could think of, because the highest one that was affected by this regulation and therefore stopped, and it was impossible or too costly or whatever it was. So they abandoned that idea, and instead they pursued the second highest. And then all the other entrepreneurs are going to build off of that idea, the second highest one. And to the extent that they're affected by that regulation, they're going to choose a second highest that is based on the second highest, and so forth. So we're going to be much, much poorer because of this one regulation. Then, of course, in the real world, we don't have one regulation of the marketplace. We
I
don't
think
have.
about the audio industry, and I think about the cafe standards, right? Isn't that what they call it? Cafe standards, where all these safety feature after safety feature was mandatory implemented. And I'm not, not to go crazy, but we talk about freedom and liberty. The next safety feature is a kill switch that the company can turn off your car at any time. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds like that's in our best interest, right? So even those.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't really matter if it's a regulation that is implemented for a good reason. There can be such regulations, but we have to realize what the real cost is. And I think
Right.
most analyses so far, if you ask any economist, and he or she will crunch all the numbers and use all this data and whatever else, and produce a cost estimate of how much will this regulation cost and what will we gain from it. Well, they never ever consider the unrealized, which is what I talk about in the book, which is the higher prosperity trajectory that we are no longer on. That's not part of it, because they're
Right.
thinking about it in a short term, so it's not cumulative, and they're also not thinking about it in terms of an economy that is entrepreneurial. They're thinking about it in terms of an economy that is in equilibrium.
Yeah.
So the cost that they're calculating is so much lower than the real cost, which means that most regulations seem to be worth it. I'm sure there could be regulations that are worth it, even considering the real cost, but not tens of thousands new ones every year as the Congress delivers to us. That's just
Right.
impossible.
And I think of a good example would be Volvo. I think they invented the 3-point harness. Now, I believe they invented that so they could sell that as a safety feature for their cars so it would increase their sales. And I think it worked because I think it was some revolutionary thing that increased safety and people could walk away from car accidents. But that there was no regulation there. They invented this, and then other companies said, "Oh, no, we're losing market share because of this innovation," and then they copied it. So even without a regulation, safety, for example, can be enhanced because people see safety and value in those extra products that those companies make, right? To try to be differentiators, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ask any consumer, would you like a safe car or an unsafe car? I mean, the value is whatever satisfies us on whatever grounds, but of course we prefer safety over not being safe, especially if you have a family and whatnot else, and you want to drive them, your kids, and whatever else to the school, and you go, "Well, this is a really unsafe car. I'll pick that one." No, and so the company will make money off of satisfying consumers, and consumers, they tend to love their lives and their loved ones, and they want as much value in whatever sense possible. But you always have to balance things, because you can build a really safe car, or we can call it a tank, but that's not very you're not going to get a very good gas mileage off of that one. You're also going to have to build really, really sturdy roads, not to destroy all the roads. You can't park it. I mean, there are plenty of other problems. So you have to balance those things. And producers of cars, they have to always try to figure out what does the future consumer want in terms of this balance? How much safety, how much gas mileage, how much of this, how much of that? And that's how they make money, by getting as close as possible and then learning from everybody else if they did better, and then implementing that and always improving the products, right? That's how they
Yeah.
compete and try to stay in business. Regulations, they typically do not actually, it's a myth that a lot of people believe, that no business would produce a safe car, say, or have a 3-point safety belt or whatever else, um, uh, without regulators doing that. Well, regulators almost always trail the development. They usually implement this regulation when most businesses have already implemented it, because, well, it it's in their own interest, because consumers are better
Right.
off. And we see that now with the European Union. It's a great example where the idiots in Brussels and Strasbourg, they have they force all manufacturers of cell phones to use USB-C ports for charging. So you cannot make a phone and sell it in Europe unless you use USB-C for charging phones.
And that forced Apple to do it here just as a production implementation because it just would make sense to do it because you have to do it half, you might as well just completely
Right.
redesign it.
Right. And then you can ask yourself, okay, how long has USB-C been a standard? Is it the best one we got? Is it the best one we're going to have? No, of course not. And USB-C is already pretty old. It's been around for a while. I mean, that's why it's
Mhm.
already in a lot of products. But what is the next thing? Well, they're already working on that, or they were, but now, since
Right.
they first have to change the law in all of Europe in order to sell a phone with a better charger, it doesn't make any sense to invest in that, right? Because you
And
have
now
to
they're
invest in all.
stifled. Right.
Right. So
It's yeah.
innovation stops and invention stops because regulators stepped in and said, "Oh, isn't it great that we all can have the same charger?" Well, sure, it would be great, but that's why the market has standards too.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it's already sets this bar here. When the bar was here and say you're a new phone inventor and you're like, "I wanna get in the phone business." I but I have to use old parts to start. So you're using the USB micro because you don't have the USB-C, like, you're not ready to do it yet. So now you're completely boxed out of the market that you're trying to invent something new and start something from the ground up, and you can't even get to do it. You don't even get your foot in the door because they're already set all these obstacles at this level that you have to grow to that as a company. You can't just start there in most cases.
Right, and imagine if they had implemented this regulation with the USB micro or whatever, which is even older, right?
Mhm.
Well, that means that you couldn't charge your phone as fast as you can today because you had to rely on that older standard. And you also couldn't have faster uh, uh, data transfers through the cord because you had the USB micro, unless, of course, you had a phone with several different ports, but that doesn't make any sense either. So there's a reason why manufacturers didn't choose to have a phone saying, much like a computer saying, "Hey, look at this. We got 3 different USB ports, and then we have this one. There's our own proprietary one, and then we have." They don't have that, and there's a reason for that, right? No one
Right.
appreciates that, so they chose not to. So I think we're going to be stuck now with USB-C, and USB-C is a good technology, but it's not the best we can do, and
We
it's
can always improve, I
yeah.
think is the
And
point, right?
right,
Yeah.
and politicians never get this. And when do you think a politician learns about USB-C and figures out that, "Oh, this is really great technology"? Do you
Oh,
think
it's
that
when they forgot their cable at the hotel room and they can't charge their phone. That's the only reason that I guarantee that regulation came up because some stupid politician forgot to charge their phone and didn't bring their cable, and it didn't wasn't compatible or something, and they're like,
right?
"This has to change. I'm gonna make it change." You know?
Oh, absolutely, and then he talked with all his colleagues, and they started to push for this new law. But do you think this was in the beginning, in the early stages where USB-C was sort of becoming a thing, or do you think it was in the tail end when USB-C was already all over the place and everybody was using
Right.
it? Well, of course, it
Oh,
was at the tail
absolutely.
end. It was the
Of
tail end,
course,
of course.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Of
it
course
was
it's always on the
already
back end of that.
yeah, it was already ripe for disruption, was ripe to be, uh, replaced by a better standard, but
And
it
that's one
can't
of the
anymore
challenges about
because
government.
politicians.
And that's a challenge about government is they are so far behind on the things that matter, and the things that really matter now because we are looking at a technocracy. This is a technology world. Twitter, all this stuff is running the show. These people are so ahead of the curve, and these politicians have no idea about regulating like Prop 230 and all this stuff. You're sitting there watching this Section 230, and none of this makes any sense with how they're even able to wrap their heads around it. So it's like, why are we giving people this power to dictate these rules over us when they don't even understand how to turn on the thing or how to implement or how to work it, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question, and, I don't think anybody knows because most people they just can't listen to the stuff and they don't know about it. And I mean, even people in Congress, they don't read the bills because there's way too long and too much crap in there. So they're just going to trust on whatever someone says about them, right? But because there are thousands of pages, so no one is going to read that, and they maybe they get a copy the day before and then go here, vote on this for tomorrow. Like, well, who can
Right.
read 1,000 pages overnight? And that's probably not the only thing they're voting on either, and they do this on purpose, of course, because then they can sneak all kinds of crap in there, that they themselves benefit from, and then the masses pay for. But I mean, the whole government is is really just a way of extracting wealth from the many and give it to the few, and they do so in using prestige and power because that's what usually drives politicians more than money, really. And it's really just a way of getting rich. It's a getting rich scheme, and none of it is really intended to do what they say they're doing, because what they say they're doing is is keeping the peace, making sure that no one is poor, and making sure that the infrastructure is up to date and whatever else. All these good things, which are always the very opposite of what they're doing.
Absolutely. So I wanted to touch one more thing about regulations only because once again, I'm a neophyte. I was a grade 8 neocon in the '90s, actually. I enlisted for the military. I had a Saddam, "Hey Saddam, this Scud's for you" T-shirt. I was all in, okay? I believed that the WMDs were there, and I believed Gaddafi was a bad guy. I believed it all. I ate it like and it broke my heart. Absolutely broke my heart. So whenever I talk about these things, it's so hard to deprogram. It's I mean, I'm so programmed because I'm not Ancapistan yet, but the more it's been a rapid acceleration since I've cracked the edge a little bit. And I was at Freedom Fest and saw people like Tom Woods speak about diarrhea of psychosis and things like that. And I'm so honored to be at Freedom Fest. And that really accelerated for me. So Justin's a good friend of mine. He's a little more conservative minded, kind of where I was maybe 5 years ago. But it's still about regulations. We do think that these things are for our benefit, right? So no regulation sounds like a good thing for production of physical items like chairs, tables, things like that. But the same be said for, I'm assuming, supplements, lotions, cough syrups, things like that? Please share your thoughts about the FDA because I think there is a very big libertarian mindset about what the FDA is, and I'm tying that in a little bit. I'll put Zach's question up as well. But if you could talk a little about the FDA and what health regulations might be with RFK or something like that as well.
Yeah, there's a great book by Mary Ruwart, a friend of mine, and also she's been in the libertarian movement for quite a while. She's a biologist, I think, or she's a doctor in that sense. Death by Regulation, where she goes through how many people are killed every year by the FDA and their regulations. Part of it is, of course, that we don't have the right to use our bodies. So if we are diagnosed with a disease that is going to kill us and there's no treatment available, well, we're not really allowed to try different things, and the doctors are not allowed to try and prescribe us things uh, for us either that have not been properly tested and stuff like that. And
Off
there,
label, right? I've heard.
Well, off-label and also new drugs that haven't been tested appropriately yet, unless I guess it's an mRNA shot, because then it doesn't really apply anymore.
It doesn't count. Let's not,
Yeah.
yeah, we
But she calculates in that book, how many years are lost all the time because people don't have a right to try things when they're dying, which is and it's a lot. And of course, if FDA is just a way of keeping profits really high in big pharma. I mean, uh, people refer to it as a captured agency, and I mean that's the appropriate terminology
every
in
industry is
economics.
captured. The military's industry is captured by the Raytheons and the Lockheeds. All of them are. I mean, we've become crony capitalists. I mean, we know that this is part of the system that we need to purge, right? I mean, we know that's part of it.
Well, the United States was always corporatist. It's just that it's bigger now, uh,
Right.
and I think that the I have an issue with that term, that is a captured
Okay.
agency, because it sounds like at one point it was innocent and good, and then people with money and big businesses, they stepped in and they corrupted it. Usually, I don't think that is the case, because the agency is created not for the public good, even though that's usually what they say, but it's usually created for special interests, and it's usually created as a means for insiders in the market to protect themselves from competition and to make sure that their drugs can be used, but the competition cannot be used. And there's a reason why big pharma, for instance, are lobbying Congress over and over again to um, to make sure that supplements are prescription based. So I mean, if you go to one of those uh, health and supplement stores, little now and then they have a list where they want you to sign your name to protest, because once again there's this bill coming to the state capitol or the DC or whatever, where they try to make sure that you have to go to the doctor and get a prescription for vitamin C, because you could overdose it, right?
Yeah, you
And that's
that
something that
vitamin D was really tough during COVID. You know, those extra 5,000 EUs, IUs that you happen to urinate out if you happen to take too much. Oh, no. Your body just doesn't absorb it, you know?
Right, and because that might be dangerous if you completely overdo it, you shouldn't be able to at all. But that, of course, means that, well, then you go to a doctor anyway. So why can't you just get a prescription for some other thing that they have much more margin at selling? Right. So and every government agency creates an arena for buying and selling favors, and that's the whole point of it, really. That
Right.
politicians gain from it, and insiders and big businesses gain as well, because they can cement their influence. There's a reason why Walmart and Amazon, for instance, are not only promoting and advocating for, but also lobbying for a higher minimum wage. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's obvious if you think about it. It's not because they want to pay more in wages, more than they might have to otherwise, because they could just raise wages if they really, if they wanted to pay everybody $25 an hour, they could just do it. They don't need the law to tell them to do that, right? Because there's no
Yeah.
ceiling for.
Right, because 'cause I'm
Uh,
sure there's not one single person who works twice as hard as everybody else, and they actually value that they actually see the value and pay that person a little bit more, right? They don't do that at all.
Right, well, I mean, they can pay them 50 then. That
Right, right.
nothing is stopping them, but instead they're lobbying politicians to make sure that everybody pays that. And that's, of course, because they know that whoever is starting a new startup that is gonna be the next Amazon, because Amazon was very small and a startup once, right? They're not gonna have the cash flow, they're not gonna have the investment capital, they're not gonna have any of this to pay high salaries from day one, right?
Yep.
And the big businesses know this, and they also know and they understand that they are going to be replaced by some small damn store or some company started in someone's damn garage somewhere, just because they figured out how to satisfy consumers better, and that's why they're going to just take over all the customers, and they're going to grow big, and they're going to replace the businesses that are big today. So if they can stop this, which really means you're stopping innovation and invention, right? You're stopping entrepreneurship,
Yep.
then you can stay alive for longer, and you can reap in this profits. So Amazon and Walmart, by forcing all stores in their industries to pay high wages, they can probably eat the cost, but startups cannot, which means they can maintain their position in the marketplace much, much longer. So they're gaining from higher cost. And of course they know this. It's not because they're suddenly going, well, we're a really good corporation and we want to care about our workers. If that was the
Mm,
case, they could just pay them more. Easy.
right. They could be altruistic with it, but, they are a corporation, so and to that end, for example, like a Jeff Bezos, I'll admit the guy doesn't make me feel good, but I see a picture of him, 2:30 in the morning over papers, stacks of papers, working. He's putting every bit of his heart and soul into this thing, and he made it happen. And if you can't applaud that, just that effort alone, I don't know what can. The problem is now he's big and he knows what it took to get to him. So he knows what regulations to get past to keep someone from following in his footsteps or taking over the way you say. And that's the sad part about it, is that it doesn't allow for that extra cultivation to find other avenues.
Right, which means stopping the progression of the market process. That's how you keep your position, right? And if you're in a good position, well, that's in your interest. Try to do that. In a free market, you don't have the means to do that. You can't stop the progression because there are no barriers to entry. Anyone can start a business whenever they feel like it, right? As long as they can get the investment capital, which means you can have a billion different companies trying to undermine you from all kinds of directions all the time, and you can't do much about it. But with the state, you can. So you just lobby a few politicians or an agency, and then you get those favors, and you don't have to bother with those billion companies anymore. And I don't think it is a problem necessarily that a business grows big and an entrepreneur earns a ton of money and becomes a billionaire or whatever else, right? Uh, I'm not particularly interested in eating the rich or anything like that. Because in a market setting, the only way
Innovators innovate, pair. I mean, that's what it is. We have to applaud the brain. I mean, look, Elon Musk alone took on space, electric cars, tunneling. I mean, just that alone just speaks volumes to just the effort or the brain power. You just have to admire it for what it is.
yeah, and there's a fair amount of luck in it too. But the thing is,
Yes, for
when
sure.
you get rich like this, someone did a study, and I mean it was a flawed study because it doesn't recognize the unrealized and all this other stuff. So they don't recognize those issues. But I think the conclusion was that of all the value created by Amazon or through Bezos, Amazon, 1% was captured by Jeff Bezos, and 99% was captured by Amazon's customers, which is probably right because customers choose to use Amazon because they're made better off. And this was some kind of approximation of the value, which doesn't make any sense. Consumers are probably much better off than they could calculate. But still, if you're capturing 1% of the value and everybody else gets a lot of more value, it's not really an issue that you're rich. And you can only stay rich if you continue to serve people better than everybody else.
Yeah. So you've been so gracious with your time. We've got about 7, 10 minutes for an hour. I'd hate to waste any of your time. Zach had a question about price gouging. Could we talk a little bit about that? Because I did touch a little bit at the beginning of the show, but basically we've got a couple things, and I'll put up the question. But I had a question, if I may, about how someone like a Kamala can say corporate price gouging. So, if I may, this is how I perceive how money works. Say it's a dollar for the base product or for the raw material for a company to buy something. Then they make it and then they sell it to like 8 different, along the way through middlemen, right? Each of them have to make, say, a 5% margin. So if we just say everyone makes 5% margin, inflation happens. So now inflation goes up 5%. Now it's a dollar 5 for the piece instead of a dollar. But everyone still needs to make their 5%. That dollar 5 becomes a dollar 11 down the chain, then a dollar 17, and then a dollar 23, and it becomes greater and greater. Is that how they were trying to manipulate it to make it look like companies were trying to pocket this extra money when all it was they're just keeping their margin, and that's where inflation really does always hit more everyone harder than anything?
Well, you're sort of opening a can of worms here.
Okay.
So,
Oh, maybe I shouldn't do that then.
but,
Maybe
I mean, because inflation is an is interesting, but it's sort of a difficult topic today because it's the definition has changed. So we think of inflation now as higher consumer good prices. But of course, prices should vary depending on supply and demand and stuff like that, right? So if people suddenly want to buy a certain product, then the price of that product will go up until supply increases, and then the price will fall again. And if people go, nobody wants Wonder Bread anymore, then what will happen with the price of Wonder Bread? Well, it will fall. So you have deflation for Wonder Bread. I mean, but that's just a price mechanism that should happen. Prices should fluctuate. They shouldn't be stable forever. We can't expect that. So to say, for instance, that there's inflation because of supply chain issues, that doesn't make any sense at all. Of course, supply chain issues will affect the prices. Um, uh, Originally, inflation was really a metric of how much more money is there in circulation. So did you create more money to have in the economy? Because that means, well, there's more money chasing just as many goods as before, which means prices go up. So prices go up because each unit of the currency has fallen because it's diluted. That was original uh, uh, conceptualization of inflation, because economists wanted to know, okay, what are the actual impact of printing more money, as we put it today, right?
and that's what I'm talking about in the guise of COVID, right? Where, we just printed loads of money. Absolute
Oh,
just
yeah. And since the financial crisis too, we've been printing a ton of money,
yeah.
and that it will eventually hit some prices or all prices, right? So of course that means that the dollar itself is worth less compared to what it otherwise would be. It doesn't mean that the prices necessarily that we see on all goods go up, because if they otherwise would have fallen, then a no price difference is really a price increase compared to what it would have been, right? And if you think about it, in any economy where the no one is meddling with the money, what do businesses do? Well, they cut costs, they innovate better products. That's how they compete. What would you expect from that? Well, you would expect lower prices, because that's how they get the customers, right? Better product at lower
Yeah.
prices. That's
Right.
the
Invent new
normal.
materials, cheaper, lighter, faster material, things like that. They innovate.
Exactly. Exactly. So the market naturally is deflationary in that sense, because prices fall and quality goes up, right?
An example
Which
would be televisions is a great example. Electronics is a great example where prices, when
exactly.
they initially come, they're a high, cafe, high dollar amount, and then they plummet as the technology gets, more implemented and actually increases higher quality resolution, but the prices still keep continuing going down because the base technology has already been out.
Exactly. Which means if the statistic for price inflation is plus minus zero, prices have not changed. That means that prices are still higher than they otherwise would be, right? Because prices would have fallen if the market had been free and no one had tampered with with the money. So when we're talking about, uh, like they say now, that you have the 2% target. So all prices on average should increase by 2% every year, which means, of course, that, well, the dollars that you have, they retain 98% of their purchasing power each year. So we're diluting the money, and the money is falling in terms of value, and that's by design. Well, considering that we should have experienced an increased purchasing power of the dollar had no one meddled with it and the market had been free, well, those 2% suddenly translates to what? 2 plus whatever deflation we would have seen. So the 2% itself is not 2%,
So it's more than that, and that's the thing,
much
and
more.
these are the unseen things that we're talking about,
Yeah,
and so you see it on the ledger at the bottom, but you don't see how it got there, so it's like all this invisible ghost stuff, and then all of a sudden this number spits out that just completely throws your whole thing off, so
yep.
so before we call it a day, that just this price gouging thing, because we've talked about price gouging, you were just on top of it. You spoke about regulations. Once again, thank you so much for your time. If you could just share a little bit about one more thing about how to get a hold of you. I know it's at Per Bylund at on X, but if you could just answer Zach's question a little bit about price gouging, and then we'll call it an evening. And thank you so much for honoring me with your time. I know as an economist, time is valuable. So thank you.
Yeah, we economize on time too. They're right. So, uh, I mean, I would really refer Zach and everybody to a great piece by Mike Munger, the political scientist at Duke. He's also a libertarian. He wrote a piece called, I think, They Clapped. And he tells the story of a couple of, I think it was young men who realized that after a hurricane or something like that, that hey, people down there they are suffering from the heat and they have no electricity, no power, no nothing. And what do they need? They probably need a lot of ice, and we can buy a lot of ice here. It's pretty cheap, and so they packed a trailer with ice. They got a couple of chainsaws and stuff like that and extra gas, and they started driving down to the affected area. And of course, they cleared the road on the way there, and there was a lot of work, and that maybe they would lose some to the heat and whatever else. It, but they expected that they could sell it for a whole lot more when they got there, because people needed ice, right? So they got there, and people lined up because people wanted ice, and the ice was worth much more to them than the price they were paying, or otherwise they wouldn't buy it, right? And I mean, you read the article because it's actually very interesting. But the effect of their work is, of course, that it's so much easier for others to transport ice there. It's so much easier now, and others have seen that, oh, this is an opportunity. And the higher price means that there's going to be an inflow of goods there, because if you can buy ice in an unaffected area for, I don't know how much ice is, but say it's $1 a pound or whatever.
$5 a bag. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
So, but in the affected area, there is no ice. You can charge $10 and people will still gladly buy it for $10 a bag. Well, can you cover the cost of transporting it there for $9 a bag? You probably can, right? And you can sell it for less than 10. If someone else is already there selling for 10, you can sell it for 8 and still make a buck in between, right? Which means that you are really helping to ration ice, because you're taking ice from where it's not worth all that much, because people didn't buy more than usual for that regular price. But in this place where they don't have ice, they're very happy to pay 10 times as much because they don't have it and they need it, right? So that that means that the higher price attracts more of the good to the area where there's too little, which is part of how the price system works, right? It offers profits to redirect goods to where they do more good. Well, if you have a price gouging law in place, that is really just a price ceiling, saying that, well, you can't sell ice above a buck 50, say, per bag. Well, now, is it worth it for you to buy bags in an unaffected area to take it to those hurricane victims and sell it for $1.50? Well, you would have to transport a ton of bags to make up for the cost, right?
Yeah, it'd
Because
be like McDonald's cap turns. You'd have to have so much volume to make up for that smaller percentage margin or profit that you'd be
right,
making.
which means most people wouldn't even bother with it because there's not you couldn't make money off of it, and even if you made money, it's just not enough. It's not worth your time, right? So that's not going to happen. What is the outcome of that? Well, the outcome is that they don't get ice. It's that simple. Well, they can wait for FEMA to transport ice to them, but
And
I mean
and
that's not
more honestly, no one gets ice because no one's sending it there because it's not value. It's not worth it to them to do it. So
exactly.
instead of getting gouged, you just get none, and you all suffer.
Exactly. And of course, in the example in Mike Munger's article, the government had not cleared the roads, but these guys transporting the ice because they thought, hey, we can make hundreds of dollars. And they thought, oh, that was great. They cleared the roads so that others could get there with ambulances and wood and timber and whatever else people might need there. Right. So the roads were cleared faster. People got ice because of these people who were really just trying to make a buck. Right. So that's how the market works. Because if you offer something that people want a lot, they're also willing to give up a lot and still gain. And that is the case in an affected area. That doesn't mean, of course, that it's necessarily a good thing to charge a really high price. But what it does mean is that if you coerce people and if you tell them you cannot sell for a high price, you don't get these good effects at all, and then you become completely reliant on uh, benevolent government to fix all these problems. And we all know what FEMA does. It
Oh, they're
uses a lot of
so good.
money, but it's not very effective at anything except for maybe hindering private initiatives to help people.
I have a high school friend that, just talked about FEMA and is like, "FEMA's underfunded," and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, they do a job so poorly, let's give them more money." It's like it's I love, like, the mentality of that never makes sense, and I swear I'm trying to break everybody's brains. I'm trying to crack these skulls over here. We're just gotta crack the shell. We're not trying to hurt anyone. Trust me, no one starts this way, everybody. We find our way to this through experience and through time. Okay. Please, we have grace. Come to our side. We welcome you. We welcome you to this world. If we can all start thinking this way, I think life would be better. I do. Her, thank you so much. Any final thoughts on anything you'd like to share before we call it a day? Thank you again for your time. I'm so grateful.
No, this was a lot of fun, and I appreciate the questions. And I mean, do follow me on X. I'm easy to find. That's where I post every day, and I post everything else that I publish on other places. I post links to them on X.
Excellent. Thank you again. What we'll do is I'm going to hit stop here, but perhaps we've got a League of Ordinary Gentlemen. It's a panel of people that you've spoken with. We'll have to invite you when you come back from your time away, and maybe we'll just have a fun chat and just chew the fat some more.
Sounds good.
Thank you again, sir.